Welcome everyone to this edition of the Prajnya Gender Talks. For those of you who are new to this series, this is a seminar series we run most months of the year. We have a talk every month by a scholar, a writer, activist, or journalist working broadly in the area of gender and gender inequality. Today, we're very, very happy to have with us Professor Uddipana Goswami, who will be talking about gender, conflict, and peace. I'd like to just quickly introduce her before we get started with her talk. Uddipana Goswami is a writer and feminist peace researcher with a PhD in conflict studies. She's the author of 7 books, including an academic monograph, Conflict and Reconciliation, The Politics of Ethnicity in Assam, published by Routledge, and a collection of short stories set against the violent conflicts in Northeast India, No Ghosts in This City, published by Zuban. Her latest book, Gendering Peace in Violent Peripheries, Marginality, Masculinity, and Feminist Agency, published by Routledge, again, derives from her Fulbright postdoctoral research at the University of Pennsylvania. A former journalist and editor, Uddipana worked with several multinational and hyperlocal media groups from National Geographic Channel to Seven Sisters Post. As an academic, she has also taught at numerous universities, including the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Guwahati College, University of Pennsylvania, Curtis Institute of Music, and the Johns Hopkins University. So over to you, Uddipana.
Thank you for that introduction, Shakti. My talk today will mainly be based on this book, my latest book, which is called Gendering Peace in Violent Peripheries. This book actually belongs in the very slim literature that's out there on conflict habituation within peace and conflict studies. And it studies what happens when societies and communities are exposed to protracted violent conflicts. You know, where when there's prolonged militarization, when there's constant human rights abuse, extrajudicial killings, and people are exposed to various forms of personal and political violences, which are perpetrated with impunity. So even when active conflicts and violent confrontations, which happen between, say, the state and the non-state actors, between one community and another, even when these kind of direct violences are contained, let's say through signing peace treaties or ceasefire agreements, what happens is violence still persists. It remains entrenched in the structures and the cultures. That these structures and cultures do not change because these treaties and agreements, they only contain direct violence and they only manage that the direct manifestation of violence. So violence continues to manifest itself in different ways. It remains invisibly but intricately woven into the fabric of everyday life. And when I say everyday life, I mean everyday interpersonal interactions, as well as in the actions of the state, and all that happens in the political arena. And in other words, actually, violence becomes normalized. It becomes a habitual way of functioning or operating for people in the conflict zone. And they adopt and they adapt to various conflict-habituated patterns of behavior and attitude. So people in conflict-habituated societies get caught up in this web of intricate violence because this violence is insidious, but it is also overt. It is bold and direct, but it is also invisible. It is personal, it is political. It happens at home, it manifests itself in the public spaces. So like I said, a way of life, And everyday interactions, they start getting defined by this kind of violence. So if you are, this deeply submerged in it, if you are so caught up in this web, how do you recognize your own culpability? How do you recognize your complicity? And in a sense, also your victimhood, right? And how do you resist? How do you break away from this web of violence? How do you bring about change, social transformation? And most importantly, how do you cultivate positive peace in the community organically? So that is what I want to elaborate on today, using Assam as a textbook example of a conflict-habituated society, where we have to confront the existing reality of everyday violence and brutalization and dehumanization, and then, you know, do the work that needs to be done for peace. And I start by talking about a stark image of inhuman brutality that shook the world.
Uddipana, I think you might have frozen. I'm not sure.
Oh.
No, it's back now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you can hear you. Yeah.
Ah, okay. So where did you lose me?
You said you're about to start something. And
okay, awesome. So what I was saying is that I'm going to start by talking about a stark image of inhuman brutality that shook the world not very long ago. And this image came out of Assam, from the Sipajhar district of Assam in September 2021. And so this was when the government of Assam undertook to remove illegal encroachers, as they were called, primarily Muslims of East Bengali origin, from roughly, say, 4,000 acres of government land, so that landless indigenous communities could benefit from the proposed agricultural project that was going to be built there. Removal proceedings were undertaken even before the High Court could arbitrate on a petition that was filed by the villagers, who were termed encroachers, against the proposed eviction, and it was done without a prior rehabilitation plan. So the armed police were present, and amidst protests by the local community, the proceedings turned violent, as they often do. And officially, 3 people were killed, including a 12-year-old boy. The actual count of the dead and the missing may be higher, as again, you know, it usually is. So among the injured were 11 policemen. And one incident during the eviction went on to attract international attention, and it elicited very strong reactions in social media, both in social and traditional media. So this was the image of an official photographer who was documenting the eviction drive, and he went on to stomp on a man who lay dying after being shot at by the police. And this entire thing was caught on camera, and the video of the act went viral. Now, the reason I bring up this image on or this incident is because this and similarly, slightly similar other less, you know, slightly less horrifying occurrences have become the defining images of Assam on the mainland and even beyond. So, you know, Assam is a land of ethno-fascists, it is a land of xenophobic Muslim haters, etc., etc. But having witnessed, having experienced, and having studied the history of violence in Assam, I could not be comfortable with this very flat, very reductionist narrative, which ignores the complexities of the, you know, not so distant post-colonial history of conflicts and the intricate geopolitics that informs intercommunity relationships today. So as I reflected on this incident, I realized that if this is our current reality, then we must also look at the past that informs this despicable present, so that we can design solutions or alternatives for a more humane future. And you know, I started by looking at the responses within the Assamese society to this incident. And these responses, they divided the Assamese society along 2 lines, mostly, very broadly. And there were those who supported the eviction, and they were the ones who subscribed to this long-standing conviction that all members of the affected community were illegal immigrants appropriating the resources, the livelihoods of the autochthonous and the indigenous people. And this view, it persists despite the government's subsequent admission that, after receiving the reports from the deputy commissioners, etc., that there were no illegal foreigners there who were occupying any government land. Sorry. And the other section, those who were horrified by the incident, they were united in opposing the othering and the persecution of the migrant community, of course, and they counter the popular perception of the Muslim community as recent land-grabbing illegal immigrants, since it's been proven over and over again that in recent decades, Bangladesh's growing prosperity relative to Assam has dulled Assam's attraction as a migratory destination. So, meanwhile, what was happening was that the ones who settled here, the migrants who had settled here, had accepted Oromia as their mother tongue. They were identifying themselves as Oromia in consecutive census operations. They were keen to assimilate with the mainstream. And most importantly, they constitute the backbone of Assam's agricultural economy today. So they are hardworking, they're enterprising, they're innovative, they have turned uncultivable riverine land into productive land. They've introduced new methods of cultivation, new crops, and they continue to contribute to the bulk of agricultural production in Assam. So within this critically thinking Oromia people, some felt that the photographer's action was emblematic of the utter barbarism of Oromia society, a death of compassion among the people that have been, growing progressively xenophobic. And then there was another section which shifted the blame on the current right-wing government and the polarization that its anti-Muslim rhetoric has incited in Assam. Now, both these responses, they need to be considered together and connected back to the historical entrenchment of hyper-masculinist violence in Assam since its post-independence association with the Indian mainland. So I will very briefly, talk about the geopolitical history that created this, led to this condition today. So there was the partition, there was East Bengal, which later became East Pakistan, and the leaders of Assam joined the Indian Union, and there was the scramble of power in the post-colonial. The new post-colonial formations, new power centers, new margins were created, and the mainland seat of power in Delhi constructed Assam and the rest of the northeastern states as its periphery. And within this periphery, Assam was the center of power, right? And within this center of power in the periphery, there were the others, the marginalized constituencies, and these included the indigenous communities, the migrant communities, and so on. So the patriarchal power centers that were created, they engaged with the peripheral and the marginalized populations with violent machismo. The violence was cultural, it was structural, and they legitimized, for instance, let's say India's imposition of laws like the ASPA to tame the unruly people of the periphery, or it justified policies that just siphoned off the resources of the region to other parts of India. And this led to the 6-year-long Assam movement from 1979 to 1985. And there were violent reprisals, there were civilian protests everywhere, and all of that was brutally suppressed by the state agencies. Violence breeds violence, right? And armed resistance followed. Assam was plunged into more than 3 decades of bloodshed. Ethno-nationalist conflicts started, proliferated both vertically between the mainland and the periphery, horizontally between the marginalized entities within the periphery, and as in all demilitarized zones, state and non-state actors became involved in mass murders, secret killings or extrajudicial killings, covert and overt counterinsurgency operations, and there was this overall brutalization and criminalization of society. So the conflict years in Assam were a result of the marginalized people's desperation, driven by the state's disregard for human dignity and its silencing of their political will. And studying the transformations that were affected by the conflict, they proved that these years of conflict were a necessary time in the long history of Assam, when the marginalized people found a voice and those in power were forced to listen. However, what followed, the fallout of all the violence that happened, also at the same time testifies to the futility of small communities taking up arms against the powerful state and its agents. The human cost of the conflict was enormous, and the loss of human potential was also disastrous, right? Additionally, what happened was violent ideologies and their attendant machismo desensitized people and criminalized society. The counterinsurgency approach, which consolidated the security and power of the state, kind of kept fomenting conflicts and habituated the region to endemic conflicts. And this was achieved through quick fix policies, cosmetic changes that were designed to fail or designed to instigate new conflicts. I won't go into all of that here in details, but just kind of tracing the development of this hyper-masculinist violence in Assam. Now, the differences, what I want to say here is that the differences between the communities were kept alive, and keeping these differences alive between the multiple, between the communities and the fissures between the communities. This magnified, okay, it kept growing, and resistance against the state started de-escalating, because the original grievances were watered down and attention was diverted from the complexity of the conflicts. So these conflicts were not just about ethnic differences. It was also about, Assam's conflicts also involved access to resources, threats to livelihood, demographic changes, loss of language and culture, environmental degradation, impact of climate change, et cetera, et cetera. But now they have been reduced to a very simple binary narrative. It's tribal versus non-tribal, Hindu versus Muslim, indigenous versus settler, depending on who is telling the story and for whom the story is being written or told. So this reductionist approach, it made conflicts more manageable for those in the centers of power, both on the mainland and in the periphery. And it also allowed for dichotomic polarizing forces like the Hindutva ideology from the mainland to consolidate in Assam in recent years. So violence, anyway, is internalized. Like I said, it becomes an acceptable behavior in conflict-habituated societies. But then when a narrative of fear and a rhetoric of victimization is superimposed, what happens is it leads to brutalization of the dominant groups and dehumanization of the ones who are lower down in the ethnic hierarchy. And in Assam, below in the hierarchy are the Muslim immigrants. They moved within India, within British India, right? When East Bengal, when they were when Bangladesh was East Bengal. This was in the 19th century. So in the absence of regulated borders and effective immigration laws and propelled by political disturbances and climate disasters, their migration continued in post-colonial times. And today, what has happened is that every visibly identifiable Bengali Muslim person is considered an illegal Bangladeshi in Assam. And according to different sources, the actual number of Bangladeshi migrants in Assam varies anywhere from negligible and none to thousands who are infiltrating every day. So in the absence of clarity, right, the fear of demographic swamping and the loss of livelihood, that appears very real. Fear is what incites violence. Incidents of collective violence against this community are littered across the history of Assam, and it occurred across the state from Saulkhua Sapori to Nelly during the Assam movement, from Basbari and Khograbari during the Boro movement, and I mean, the list goes on. However, religion was never the sole or the primary factor inciting such direct violence or inspiring the seemingly innocuous everyday acts of otherization. Assam's settler indigenous conflicts are more about nativism, about access to land, livelihood, resources. On ground, these continue to be the main causes of conflict between the migrants and their neighboring communities. However, it is the popular and the political narrative that tells it differently. So when East Bengali peasants were brought in by the colonial rulers to cultivate the wastelands, as they were called, the unproductive lands, community leaders and ethnic elites from both the migrant and local communities encouraged their in-migration. Local cash-poor indigenous people sold their lands to the settlers through legal and extra-legal transactions. And in the course of time, however, what happened was the pressures on the land, the resources, the means of livelihood increased. Ethno-nationalist politics, nativist sentiments, all of that entered this volatile mix, and violence between the communities broke out. Sorry. So this pattern has been replicated in post-colonial Assam when people from the community faced with internal displacement have moved to settle elsewhere, thus coming into conflict with the earlier inhabitants, right? So in fact, you know, natural or human-induced causes like erosion or conflict have displaced both indigenous and migrant or settler communities in post-colonial times. And in the absence of immediate state assistance, they have settled in government lands. After they settle, these settlements become permanent after decades of waiting, without any positive outcome for rehabilitation. And the settlers, however, they live a very precarious life. They can be evicted at any time for a range of reasons, from, say, implementing the state's development projects to facilitating the consolidation of industrial or commercial enterprises. So, like I said, their lives are anyway precarious. Removing them without prior arrangements for rehabilitation aggravates their fear. Additionally, they are subjected to brutality and violence during the eviction. And in recent times, this was seen during the evictions at Sipajar, the one that I talked about earlier. This involved internally displaced Bengali Muslims, as well as this happened in Amsang in 2017, in the Doyang Tengani region. Amsang was 2017, 2020 again, and it's been happening in the Doyang Tengani region in 2002, 2003. Even as recently as a week ago, it happened in Guwahati, where non-Muslim people were also involved. Now, the difference, between these evictions is in the way that the stories are told. Clearing government land of encroachment is necessarily the official narrative. When it involves the East Bengali community, the super narrative of illegal immigration into Assam by these invading hordes is also introduced into the mix. And the threats posed to the local community and their religion and their language by those who have grabbed their land, all of this is highlighted. So these stories, they align perfectly with the parallel narrative that is encouraged when, let's say, the state agencies and functionaries, they highlight the names of criminals from the community on social or traditional media, thus stoking hatred and fear. Meanwhile, crime finds committers across the communities. So at the intergroup level, hate and fear are very closely related sentiments. So when after Trump came to power in America, Martha Nussbaum, she illustrated the use of hate and fear in America, how it was used to divert people's attention from the uncertainties and the difficulties that they face. So useful analysis, she says, was replaced by aggressive othering strategies. And this gave Americans the villains, they went after, villains to grasp at and keep out and keep in place. And through all of this to reinforce masculine pride. So this pride is intense. It's driven by a belief in a just world, and it's propelled by a sense of injustice and unfairness committed by the outgroup, right? And social psychologists have told us that intergroup hatred is about fear. Since the target of hate is presented as a threat, the hater feels powerless, feels emasculated, insecure, and so they lash out aggressively. And this aggression manifests itself in different ways, from seemingly harmless acts of xenophobia and racism, like using pejorative language, right, against people from a particular community. And it also includes inhuman acts like stomping on a dying man. So language, in fact, it's one of the most powerful tools of cultivating otherness. I should know, having been, a professor of rhetoric. So words can shape and reinforce narratives of collective victimization, of transgenerational victimization. People. So what happens is people who are no longer associated with cultivation of land, right? Or they prefer to educate their children in different cities or migrate to different countries in search of better livelihood. They also feel threatened by these narratives that villainize those who are farming the land and feeding the economy, right? And when these narratives are reiterated often enough, words can also convince people about the evil, immutable disposition of the other. So the illegal migrant is not the individual they meet and maybe sometimes even greet every day, right? They are their collective identity. They are the land-hungry criminals. They are breeding continuously. They are taking over the language and culture of the original inhabitants. So this rhetoric, it inspires the collective negative emotions of contempt, of disgust, anger, humiliation, revenge, you name it. And it comforts the people by giving them a sense that their in-group ties are strengthening. And this is definitely reassuring in the immediate aftermath of violent intergroup conflicts. And Assam is at that stage of, post-insurgency period where, violence is contained, direct violence is contained, and they are looking for peace. So people's attention is diverted from the fissures within and from the everyday problems of governance and unmet basic human needs. They do not critically examine the lack of say, workable systems that are guided by humane and fair immigration laws that uphold the human rights and uphold the dignity of citizens and non-citizens. And instead of demanding these laws, instead of demanding equitable land laws, let's say, or disaster management systems and rehabilitation policies, what they do is they direct their hatred towards a vulnerable group. So this hatred becomes systemized. And this systemized hatred, it empowers the haters. So police personnel fire at children, an official camera person stomps on a dying man. And as an individual, the camera person should be held accountable for his unspeakable act. But as a society, the Assamia people, they need to introspect how they nurture such inhumanity. If they admit that this is xenophobia, they must recognize where it comes from historically. And if they claim to be victims of this long history of conflict, of violence, of marginalization, of colonization, they must be able to reflect on why they cannot stand in solidarity with others who are also victims of the same history. And sorry, much of this history is really, it's a history of violence. The people of Assam, they need to confront it. They need to hold themselves accountable as perpetrators. If they are to heal collectively, they have to reconcile with each other, and they have to move past their victimization. So they must talk about the hate crimes. They must talk about the killings at Nelly, Pulungsapuri, Gawpur, Khograbari, and countless other places where different indigenous and autochthonous communities were variously involved. Globally, despite their limitations, formal and public mechanisms of truth-telling have helped post-conflict societies heal. And they do this by healing individual victims and exposing institutional and structural injustices. And in this way, they pave the way to peaceful coexistence. But there is the danger that these mechanisms may end up creating scapegoats of individual perpetrators who are named in the truth-telling processes. And this is likely to provoke retributive urges. This is, and it's especially possible and especially true of a fragmented society like Assam, where hegemonic ambitions would inform these mechanisms, and they could also divert attention from pressing questions about collective responsibility. So since many communities of Assam are currently undertaking to redefine their nationalist and ethno-nationalist goals in the post-insurgency period, they must guard against selective truths and alternate facts while they are reflecting on our collective history of violence and hate. And at the same time, they also need to challenge and change the hyper-masculinist, the apathetic systems of government that erode compassion and prevent them from standing together in sisterhood and solidarity. So politics is based upon people's emotions, and governments are all about people, right? So instead of focusing entirely on power, on security and order, the people must ensure that successive governments create policies that also address human suffering. So such humane policies are essential to ensure human security. And they also have a very crucial role to play in state security, because if you think about what's happening right now, the current global narrative, especially since the updating of the National Register of Citizens and the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, the current narrative is one of anti-Muslim politics and polemics in Assam. So while this does not encompass the on-ground realities, it does have the potential to turn global hate towards Assam and make it vulnerable to external threats. So compassion towards marginalized communities and policies that alleviate their sufferings can overturn these narratives and can counter these threats. So Such policies can be formulated, however, only if the people understand and they accept that human history is one of migration, it's one of population movements, and all are subject to shifting and arbitrary political boundaries. So Assam's indigenous communities, for example, say the Karbis, among whom I have worked extensively, they still sing of ancient migrations with their memory, collective memory of ancient migrations is still fresh in their music. If we talk about the Hindu Oromia, the dominant community, so many families, Oromia Hindu families, they trace their origins back, not to ancient origins and roots, back to different parts of mainland India, and they do it with pride. So, in an age of human mobility, protecting state borders cannot preclude the protection of migrants or refugees and non-citizens. So I want to conclude by saying that the people of Assam must stand up as a community to demand policies and laws that uphold the dignity, equity, and the basic human rights for all, irrespective of origin, irrespective of ethnicity and citizenship status. And they can do this if they move out of the narrative of victimization and if they refuse to succumb to the politics of fear. And yeah, that's all I have to say today.
Thank you so much. That was just such a fascinating talk. I think you gave us such a clear picture of the dynamics in the area, and also tying it to this demonization of immigrants that we see in other contexts. But also I think we really got a sense of the specificities of what's happening in Assam. I do have some questions, but maybe if anyone else would like to go first, I'll open the floor. If anyone has questions for Uddipana, please feel free to unmute or raise your hand. Okay, maybe I will kick things off. I was actually wondering, you were speaking about how certain instances of eviction portrayed in a certain way, and then when it involves, say, Bengali Muslims, it becomes about something else. This added layer is there as well. I was just wondering, even if you look at regional language media as well as maybe English language media, what role do you see them playing in Assam in sort of furthering this narrative? I'm quite curious to know what's happening there.
The same. Mm-hmm. It's across social and traditional media. It's whether it's the English language media or the Oromia language, and it's sad. It's I haven't yet seen anybody really speak out, and when I say anybody, I mean people who are actively in the media scene here. I know of people who have now moved away from traditional media and who are who still do talk about this. I know creative writers who are doing this. I know public intellectuals who are speaking out. But in this climate of fear, right, in the kind of atmosphere that we are living in, where even a social media post can get you incarcerated, I think it's very difficult for people to speak out. And that is one of the things that I grappled with when I was, putting forward these solutions that people, these things that suggestions that people should be doing in order to counter this public and political rhetoric of fear and hatred. So how do you do it, right? How do you speak up in a climate like this, in a climate of fear like this? How do you hold on to hope of a more humane future? So it's a really sad state of affairs, I must say. But there are ways of doing it, and one of the things that I look at in my book, and that's like the entire, I think, last chapter of the book, is how, like I said, holding on to hope. That is, hope is cognitive. It kind of gives you, fear inhibits cognition. Fear inhibits action, right? But hope is, hope leads you to action, to take positive action towards creating peace or towards making social change. So holding on to that and being cautiously radical. And there are times when we have to be radical. There are times when we have to take to the streets, and we will do that. We have to do that, right? When the time for it comes. But what do you do when the conditions are such? So being cautiously radical, being strategic about how you, overturn this narrative. That is something that we need to work towards. And I think the way to do it is to look at the marginalized spaces. So that's what I have done. I've looked at how, let's say, the women of Assam, how they are coping with the post-insurgency realities, how they are creating peace within their own marginalized existences, how the migrant community, for instance, how they have, how they how they functioned, how they rode that wave of the NRC, how they all came together and work together to counter that threat. And there are lessons to be learned from these the agency in the margins. So yeah, I think there's hope.
Yeah, it's good to know. Do you see a role for feminists more generally across the country or even outside to contribute in some way to further this agenda of peace? What do you think, possibly can be done?
So one of the things that came to my mind when I started writing this book, right, was a sense that most of the feminist interventions that happen, or most of the activism that happens, it's concentrated in the heartlands, and the peripheries, the hinterlands, they are often overlooked. So when you're talking about, say, South Asian feminism, right, a lot is being done there, and a lot more needs to be done there. But look at any of the projects that are happening on the mainland or outside of India as well, South Asian feminists who are ensconced in the Western academia. The Northeast doesn't exist there. There are very few voices. I mean, they do acknowledge, right? And I do not want to say that there is no recognition of the fact that, there's a lot happening here, that women are, like the women of Nagaland, the women of Manipur. I mean, they have been doing amazing work, right? Amazing peace work, very powerful work. And there is an acknowledgement of that, but the voices from the periphery, somehow they are muted. I mean, they are not, they need to be amplified, so, which is why I wrote this book, which is why I said we have to speak, and create that space for ourselves. And even when you're talking about trans-border, trans-regional feminisms, so there's a lot, of talk about trans-border solidarities between Asian feminist movements. You connect across the borders, but the borders are not included. The borders are overlooked. So a lot needs to be done there. So again, that is why my focus on the peripheries, how marginalized communities or entities within the peripheries, geopolitical peripheries, how do they cope with the everyday hypermasculinist violence? How do they work towards peace?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Does anyone want to jump in now with any questions, any reflections? Anything you'd like to say to Uddipana? Please go ahead.
Did I answer all questions?
It was a really exhaustive talk. You covered so much in the time you had. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
I did also I was wondering with, you touched on this sort of anti-Muslim rhetoric that you see in Assam. And of course, this is something we're seeing across the country now. I was just wondering, if you look at the region specifically, how much does it draw from that wider rhetoric? How much does it have its own flavor? And of course, I know ethnicity will play a role here as well in Assam to give it a sort of different spin to it. But I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about that as well.
So yeah, that's something that I did touch upon, when I was talking about how this, the Hindutva ideology, for instance, came into the Northeast, right? And how it is made possible by the kind of, the conflict history that we have, where there are these marginalized communities, and there are, there's always been this super narrative of, these migrants who are the others, the religious others, the linguistic others, and that is the state narrative, which has been internalized, right? And if you go on the ground, it's a different narrative altogether. It's there, like I said, it's the super narrative. It's the one that shows, right? That's the overt narrative. But even now, when you go into the interior areas, it's about land, it's about resources, and it's because of this, of how these conflicts have been kept alive. It's because of how the fissures between the communities, the fragmentation that I was talking about earlier, how they have been kept alive and managed, that it's been possible for such a polarizing narrative like the Hindu ideology to come into this region, and to, it's everywhere now. It's worse than it ever was. But the fact is that it was always there. It's just been amplified now because of this, if I can say, this import from the mainland.
Right.
So yeah, it's the same, but same but different, like they say.
Yeah.
There's much more.
Sorry?
There's much more to it than just the, the anti-Muslim sentiment. So that needs to be taken into account. And that was something that was, I think, highlighted during the anti-Ka movement, the Citizenship Amendment movement, and the NRC debate, and the detention camps and everything. So that has been happening for a long time now. And it's just that instead of trying to understand these complexities and look at everything in a historicized, kind of rounded, holistic manner, it feels like the current narrative has just latched onto that one thing, that one dimension of it.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, that's not always the only story, because stories are always layered.
As you highlighted, there's often other kinds of insecurity that lead this to become, what is pushed to the forefront. Yeah.
And then when you keep, repeating the same narrative over and over again, it becomes the only narrative. And that is something that needs to be avoided at all costs.
Because we then don't address the underlying issues that are.
Yeah.
I think you have a comment from Shruti, who's just saying, she really enjoyed your talk. And yes, of course, we always wish more people would talk, but this is it's being recorded, it's going up on YouTube. So please share the talk widely. I'm sure many more people would love to listen to it. Sancharni also is thanking you for a great talk.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.
And I guess maybe, I don't know if there are any other questions, but maybe if not, we can wrap up, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, so all right. Thank you again so much, Uddipana. It was really, a wonderful way to, I think, spend our mornings listening to you talk about this very important issue. And I look forward to reading your book now. I'll be sure to get a copy. So thank you so much. And yeah, take care. Thank you.
I'd love to have your feedback on the book once you've read it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And thank you for having me here.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Thank you, Joel. I see your hearts there. Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye.